Section 27 of An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Book 2 by John Locke. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 28 of Moral Relations. 1. Besides the before-mentioned occasions of time, place, and causality, of comparing or referring things to one another, there are, as I have said, infinite others, some whereof I shall mention. First, the first I shall name is some one simple idea, which being capable of parts or degrees accords an occasion of comparing the subjects wherein it is to one another, in respect to that simple idea, v.g. whiter, sweeter, equal, more, etc. These relations, depending on the equality and excess of the same simple idea, in several subjects, may be called, if one will, proportional, and that these are only conversant about those simple ideas received from sensation or reflection, it is so evident that nothing need be said to evince it. 2. Secondly, another occasion of comparing things together or considering one thing so as to include in that consideration some other thing is the circumstance of their origin or beginning, which being not afterwards to be altered, make the relations depending thereon as lasting as the subjects to which they belong, v.g. father and son, brothers, cousin germans, etc., which have their relations by one community of blood, wherein they partake in several degrees, countrymen, i.e. those were born in the same country or tract of ground, and these I call natural relations, wherein we may observe that mankind have fitted their notions and words to the use of common life and not to the truth and extent of things. For it is certain that in reality the relation is the same betwixt the begetter and the begotten, in the several races of other animals as well as men. But yet it is seldom said, this bull is the grandfather of such a calf, or that two pigeons are cousin germans. It is very convenient that by distinct names these relations should be observed and marked out in mankind, there being occasion both in laws and other communications one with another to mention and take notice of men under these relations, from whence also arise the obligations of several duties amongst men, whereas in brutes, men having very little or no cause to mind these relations, they have not thought fit to give them distinct and peculiar names. This, by the way, may give us some light into the different state and growth of languages, which, being suited only to convenience of communication, are proportioned to the notions men have, and the commerce of thoughts familiar amongst them, and not to the reality or extent of things, nor to the various respects might be found amongst them, nor the different abstract considerations might be framed about them. Where they had no philosophical notions, there they had no terms to express them. And it is no wonder men should have framed no names for those things they found no occasion to discourse of. From whence it is easy to imagine why, as in some countries, they may have not so much as the name for a horse, and in others, where they are more careful of the pedigrees of their horses than of their own, that there they may have not only names for particular horses, but also of their several relations of kindred to one another. Thirdly, sometimes the foundation of considering things with reference to one another is some act whereby anyone comes by a moral right, power, or obligation to do something. Thus, a general is one that hath power to command an army, and an army under a general is a collection of armed men obliged to obey one man. A citizen or a burgher is one who has a right to certain privileges in this or that place. All this sort depending upon men's wills or agreement in society, I call instituted or voluntary, and may be distinguished from the natural in that they are most, if not all of them, some way or another alterable and separable from the persons to whom they have sometimes belonged, though neither of the substances so related be destroyed. Now, though all these are reciprocal as well as the rest, and contain in them a reference of two things one to another, yet because one of the two things often wants a relative name, importing that reference, men usually take no notice of it, and the relation is commonly overlooked, v.g. a patron and client are easily allowed to be relations, but a constable or dictator are not so readily, at first hearing, considered as such. because there is no peculiar name for those who are under the command of a dictator or constable, expressing a relation to either of them, though it be certain that either of them hath a certain power over some others, and so is so far related to them, as well as a patron is to his client, or a general to his army. 4. Fourthly, there is another sort of relation, which is the conformity or disagreement men's voluntary actions have to a rule to which they are referred, and by which they are judged of, which, I think, may be called moral relation, as being that which denominates our moral actions and deserves well to be examined, there being no part of knowledge wherein we should be more careful to get determined ideas and avoid, as much as may be, obscurity and confusion. Human actions, when with their various ends, objects, manners, and circumstances, they are framed into distinct complex ideas, are, as has been shown, so many mixed modes, a great part whereof have names annexed to them. Thus, supposing gratitude to be a readiness to acknowledge and return kindness received, polygamy to be the having more wives than one at once, when we frame these notions thus in our minds, we have there so many determined ideas of mixed modes. But this is not all that concerns our actions. It is not enough to have determined ideas of them, and to know what names belong to such and such combinations of ideas. We have a farther and greater concernment, and that is to know whether such actions so made up are morally good or bad. 5. Good and evil, as hath been shown, are nothing but pleasure or pain, or that which occasions or procures pleasure or pain to us. Moral good and evil, then, is only the conformity or disagreement of our voluntary actions to some law, whereby good or evil is drawn on us by the will and power of the lawmaker, which good and evil, pleasure or pain, attending our observance, or breach of the law by the decree of the lawmaker, is what we call reward and punishment. 6. Of these moral rules or laws to which men generally refer, and by which they judge of the rectitude or pravity of their actions, there seem to me to be three sorts, with their three different enforcements or rewards and punishments. For since it would be utterly in vain to suppose a rule set to the free actions of men without annexing to it some enforcement of good and evil to determine his will, we must, wherever we suppose a law, suppose also some reward or punishment annexed to that law. It would be in vain for one intelligent being to set a rule to the actions of another if he had it not in his power to reward the compliance with, and punish deviation from his rule by some good and evil that is not the natural product and consequence of the action itself. For that being a natural convenience or inconvenience would operate of itself without a law. This, if I mistake not, is the true nature of all law, properly so called. 7. The laws that men generally refer their actions to judge of their rectitude or obliquity, seem to me to be these three. 1. The divine law. 2. The civil law. 3. The law of opinion or reputation, if I may so call it. By the relation they bear to the first of these, men judge whether their actions are sins or duties, by the second whether they be criminal or innocent, and by the third whether they be virtues or vices. 8. First, the divine law, whereby I mean that law which God has set to the actions of men, whether promulgated to them by the light of nature or the voice of revelation. That God has given a rule whereby men should govern themselves, I think there is nobody so brutish as to deny. He has a right to do it. We are his creatures. He has goodness and wisdom to direct our actions to that which is best, and he has power to enforce it by rewards and punishment of infinite weight and duration in another life. For nobody can take us out of his hands. This is the only true touchstone of moral rectitude, and by comparing them to this law it is that men judge of the most considerable moral good or evil of their actions. That is, whether as duties or sins, they are like to procure them happiness or misery from the hands of the Almighty. 9. Secondly, the civil law, the rule set by the Commonwealth to the actions of those who belong to it, is another rule to which men refer their actions, to judge whether they be criminal or no. This law nobody overlooks, the rewards and punishment that enforce it being ready at hand and suitable to the power that makes it, which is the force of the Commonwealth, engaged to protect the lives, liberties, and possessions of those who live according to its law, and has power to take away life, liberty, or goods from him who disobeys, which is the punishment of offenses committed against this law. 10. Thirdly, the law of opinion or reputation. Virtue and vice are names pretended and supposed everywhere to stand for actions in their own nature, right and wrong. And as far as they really are so applied, they so far are coincident with the divine law above mentioned. But yet whatever is pretended, this is visible that these names, virtue and vice, in the particular instances of their application, through the several nations and societies of men in the world, are constantly attributed only to such actions as in each country and society are in reputation or discredit. Nor is it to be thought strange that men everywhere should give the name of virtue to those actions which amongst them are judged praiseworthy, and call that vice which they account blamable, since otherwise they would condemn themselves, if they should think anything right to which they allowed not condemnation, anything wrong which they let pass without blame. Thus the measure of what is everywhere called and esteemed virtue and vice is the approbation or dislike, praise or blame, which by a secret and tacit consent establishes itself in several societies, tribes, and clubs of men in the world, whereby several actions come to find credit or disgrace amongst them, according to the judgment, maxims, or fashions of that place. For though men uniting into politic societies have resigned up to the public the disposing of all their force, so that they cannot employ it against any fellow citizens any farther than the law of the country directs, yet they retain still the power of thinking well or ill, approving or disapproving of the actions of those whom they live amongst and converse with. And by this approbation and dislike they establish amongst themselves what they will call virtue and vice. 11. That this is the common measure of virtue and vice will appear to anyone who considers that though that passes for vice in one country, which is counted a virtue, or at least not vice in another, yet everywhere virtue and praise, vice and blame go together. Virtue is everywhere that which is thought praiseworthy, and nothing else but that which has the allowance of public esteem is called virtue. Virtue and praise are so united that they are called often by the same name. Sunt sua premia laudi, says Virgil, and so Cicero. Nihil habet natura praestatanis, quam honestatem, quam laudem, quam dignitatem, quam decis, which he tells you are all the names for the same thing. This is the language of the heathen philosophers, who well understood wherein their notion of virtue and vice consisted, and though perhaps by the different temper, education, fashion, maxims, or interests of different sorts of men, it fell out that what was thought praiseworthy in one place escaped not censure in another, and so in different societies virtues and vices were changed, yet as to the main, they for the most part kept the same everywhere. For since nothing can be more natural than to encourage with esteem and reputation that wherein everyone finds his advantage, and to blame and discountenance the contrary, it is no wonder that esteem and discredit, virtue and vice, should in great measure everywhere correspond with the unchangeable rule of right and wrong which the law of God hath established. There being nothing that so directly and visibly secures and advances the general good of mankind in this world as obedience to the laws he has set them, and nothing that breeds such mischiefs and confusion as the neglect of them. And therefore men, without renouncing all sense and reason, and their own interest, which they are so constantly true to do, could not generally mistake in placing their commendation and blame on that side that really deserved it not. Nay, even those men whose practice was otherwise failed not to give their approbation right, few being depraved to that degree as not to condemn, at least in others, the faults they themselves were guilty of, whereby even in the corruption of manners the true boundaries of the law of nature, which ought to be the rule of virtue and vice, were pretty well preferred. so that even the exhortations of inspired teachers have not feared to appeal to common repute. Whatsoever is lovely, whatsoever is of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise. 12. If anyone shall imagine that I have forgot my own notion of a law, when I make a law, whereby men judge of virtue and vice, to be nothing else but the consent of private men, who have not authority enough to make a law, especially wanting that which is so necessary and essential to a law, a power to enforce it. I think I may say that he who imagines commendation and disgrace not to be strong motives to men, to accommodate themselves to the opinions and rules of those with whom they converse, seems little skilled in the nature or history of mankind, the greatest part whereof he shall find to govern themselves chiefly, if not solely, by this law of fashion. And so they do that which keeps them in reputation with their company, little regard to the laws of gods or the magistrate. The penalties that attend the breach of God's law, some, nay, perhaps most men, seldom seriously reflect on, and amongst those that do, many, whilst they break the law, entertain thoughts of future reconciliation, and making their peace for such breaches. And as to the punishments due from the laws of the commonwealth, they frequently flatter themselves with the hopes of impunity. But no man escapes the punishment of their censure and dislike who offends against the fashion and opinion of the company he keeps, and would recommend himself to. Nor is there one of 10,000 who is stiff and insensible enough to bear up under the constant dislike and condemnation of his own club. He must be of a strange and unusual constitution who can content himself to live in constant disgrace and disrepute with his own particular society. Solitude many men have sought and been reconciled to, but nobody that has the least thought or sense of a man about him can live in society under the constant dislike and ill opinion of his familiars and those he converses with. This is a burden too heavy for human suffering, and he must be made up of irreconcilable contradictions who can take pleasure in company and yet be insensible of contempt and disgrace from his companions. 13. These three then, first the law of God, secondly the law of politic societies, thirdly the law of fashion or private censure, are those to which men variously compare their actions, and it is by their conformity to one of these laws that they take their measures, when they would judge of their moral rectitude and denominate their actions good or bad. 14. Whether the rule to which, as to a touchstone, we bring our voluntary actions to examine them by, and try their goodness, and accordingly to name them, which is, as it were, the mark of the value we set upon them. Whether I say we take that rule from the fashion of the country, or the will of a lawmaker, the mind is easily able to observe the relation any action hath to it, and to judge whether the action agrees or disagrees with the rule, and so hath a notion of moral goodness or evil, which is either conformity or not conformity of any action to that rule, and therefore is often called moral rectitude. This rule being nothing but a collection of several simple ideas, the conformity thereto is but so ordering the action that the simple ideas belonging to it may correspond to those which the law requires. And thus we see how moral beings and notions are founded on and terminated in these simple ideas we have received from sensation or reflection. For example, let us consider the complex idea we signify by the word murder. And when we have taken it asunder and examined all the particulars, we shall find them to amount to a collection of simple ideas derived from reflection or sensation. First, from reflection on the operations of our own minds, we have the ideas of willing, considering, purposing beforehand, malice, or wishing ill to another, and also of life or perception and self-motion. Secondly, from sensation, we have the collection of those simple, sensible ideas which are to be found in a man and of some action, whereby we put an end to perception and motion in the same man, all which simple ideas are comprehended in the word murder. This collection of simple ideas being found by me to agree or disagree with the esteem of the country I have been bred in, and to be held by most men there worthy praise or blame, I call the action virtuous or vicious. If I have the will of a supreme invisible lawgiver for my rule, Then, as I suppose the action commanded or forbidden by God, I call it good or evil, sin or duty. And if I compare it to the civil law, the rule made by the legislative power of the country, I call it lawful or unlawful, a crime or no crime. So that whensoever we take the rule of moral actions, or by what standards soever we frame in our minds the ideas of virtues or vices, they consist only and are made up of collections of simple ideas, which we originally received from sense or reflection, and their rectitude or obliquity consists in the agreement or disagreement with those patterns prescribed by some law. 15. To conceive rightly of moral actions, we must first take notice of them under this twofold consideration. First, as they are in themselves each made up of such a collection of simple ideas. Thus, drunkenness or lying signify such or such a collection of simple ideas, which I call mixed modes, and in this sense they are as much positive absolute ideas as the drinking of a horse or speaking of a parrot. Secondly, our actions are considered good, bad, or indifferent, and in this respect they are relative, it being their conformity to or disagreement with some rule that makes them to be regular or irregular, good or bad. And so, as far as they are compared with a rule and thereupon denominated, they come under relation. Thus, the challenging and fighting with a man as it is a certain positive mode or particular sort of action by particular ideas distinguished from all others is called dueling, which when considered in relation to the law of God will deserve the name sin, to the law of fashion, in some countries, valor and virtue, and to the municipal laws of some governments, a capital crime. In this case, when the positive mode has one name and another name as it stands in relation to the law, the distinction may as easily be observed as it is in substances where one name, v.g. man, is used to signify the thing, another, v.g. father, to signify the relation. 16. But because very frequently the positive idea of the action and its moral relation are comprehended together under one name, and the same word made use of to express both the mode or action and its moral rectitude or obliquity, therefore the relation itself is less taken notice of, and there is often no distinction made between the positive idea of the action and the reference it has to a rule. By which confusion of these two distinct considerations under one term, those who yield too easily to the impression of sounds and are forward to take names for things are often misled in their judgment of actions. Thus the taking from another what is his, without his knowledge or allowance, is properly called stealing. But that name being commonly understood to signify also the moral pravity of the action and to denote its contrariety to the law, men are apt to condemn whatever they hear called stealing as an ill action, disagreeing with the rule of right. And yet the private taking away his sword from a madman to prevent his doing mischief, though it be properly denominated stealing, as the name of such a mixed mode, yet when compared to the law of God and considered in its relation to that supreme rule, it is no sin or transgression, though the name stealing ordinarily carries such an intimation with it. 17. And thus much for the relation of human actions to a law, which therefore I call moral relation. It would make a volume to go over all sorts of relations. It is not therefore to be expected that I should here mention them all. It suffices to our present purpose to show by these what the ideas are we have of this comprehensive consideration called relation, which is so various and the occasions of it so many as there can be of comparing things one to another, that it is not very easy to reduce it to rules or under just heads. Those I have mentioned, I think, are some of the most considerable, and such as may serve to let us see from whence we get our ideas of relations and wherein they are founded. But before I quit this argument from what has been said, give me leave to observe. 18. First, that it is evident that all relation terminates in, and is ultimately founded on those simple ideas we have got from sensation or reflection, so that all that we have in our thoughts ourselves, if we think of anything or have any meaning, or would signify to others, when we use words standing for relations, is nothing but some simple ideas, or collections of simple ideas, compared with another. This is so manifest in that sort called proportional that nothing can be more. For when a man says honey is sweeter than wax, it is plain that his thoughts in this relation terminate in this simple idea, sweetness, which is equally true of all the rest. Though where they are compounded or decompounded, the simple ideas they are made up of are perhaps seldom taken notice of. V.g. when the word father is mentioned, first there is meant that particular species or collective idea signified by the word man. Secondly, those sensible, simple ideas signified by the word generation. And thirdly, the effects of it, all the simple ideas signified by the word child. So the word friend being taken for a man who loves and is ready to do good to another, has all these following ideas to the making of it up. First, all the simple ideas comprehended in the word man or intelligent being. Secondly, the idea of love. Thirdly, the idea of readiness or disposition. Fourthly, the idea of action, which is any kind of thought or motion. Fifthly, the idea of good, which signifies anything that may advance his happiness and terminates at last, if examined, in particular simple ideas, of which the word good in general signifies anyone, but if removed from all simple ideas quite, it signifies nothing at all. And thus also all moral words terminate at last, though perhaps more remotely, in a collection of simple ideas, the immediate signification of relative words being very often other supposed known relations, which, if traced one to another, still end in simple ideas. 19. Secondly, that in relations we have, for the most part, if not always, as clear a notion of the relation as we have of those simple ideas wherein it is founded, agreement or disagreement, whereupon relation depends, being things whereof we have commonly as clear ideas as of any other whatsoever, it being but the distinguishing simple ideas or their degrees one from another, without which we could have no distinct knowledge at all. For if I have a clear idea of sweetness, light, or extension, I have too of equal, or more or less of each of these. If I know what it is for one man to be born of a woman, vis Sempronia, I know what it is for another man to be born of the same woman, Sempronia, and so have as clear a notion of brothers as of births, and perhaps clearer. For if I believed that Sempronia dug Titus out of the parsley bed, as they used to tell children, and thereby became his mother, and that afterwards, in the same manner, she dug Caius out of the parsley bed, I had as clear a notion of the relation of brothers between them as if I had all the skill of a midwife. The notion that the same woman contributed as mother equally to their births, though I were ignorant or mistaken in the manner of it, being that on which I grounded the relation, and that they agreed in that circumstance of birth, let it be what it will. The comparing with them in their descent from the same person without knowing the particular circumstances of that descent is enough to found my notion of their having or not having the relation of brothers. But though the ideas of particular relations are capable of being as clear and distinct in the minds of those who will duly consider them as those of mixed modes, and more determined than those of substances, yet the names belonging to relation are often as doubtful and uncertain signification as those of substances or mixed modes, and much more than those of simple ideas. Because relative words being the marks of this comparison, which is made only by men's thoughts, and is an idea only in men's minds, men frequently apply them to different comparisons of things according to their own imaginations, which do not always correspond with those of others using the same name. 20. Thirdly, that in these I call moral relations, I have a true notion of relation by comparing the action with the rule, whether the rule be true or false. For if I measure anything by a yard, I know whether the thing I measured be longer or shorter than that supposed yard, though perhaps the yard I measure by be not exactly the standard, which indeed is another inquiry. For though the rule be erroneous, and I mistaken in it, yet the agreement or disagreement observable in that which I compare with makes me perceive the relation. Though measuring by a wrong rule, I shall thereby be brought to judge amiss of its moral rectitude, because I have tried it by that which is not the true rule. Yet I am not mistaken in the relation which that action bears the rule I compare it to, which is agreement or disagreement. End of section 27.